War makes people more religious. Some of the more cynical critics of religion have said the inverse, that religion causes war.
Because of the respect we accord religious faith, we're very slow to acknowledge its causal role in conflict.
So I'd say, on the whole, we'd be better off without the belief either in a supreme dictator, because that leads to violence, or the idea that God takes sides in our pathetic mammalian disputes.
Christopher Hitchens points to the Israel-Palestine conflict as an example. In his estimation, if religion hasn't caused war, it has at least amplified war in situations like this. And I'm not here to debunk that. Some studies have corroborated that religious fundamentalism is associated with greater support for extreme military interventions. That might be a topic for a future video, but what happens after the war? What happens after you've been exposed to the trauma of witnessing violence, the trauma of losing loved ones or suffering severe injury from war? A team of anthropologists led by the scholar Joe Henrich set out to answer this, surveying 3 war-torn countries, Uganda, Sierra Leone, and Tajikistan, focusing primarily on Christian and Muslim communities. They found that people exposed to violent conflict in these regions were more likely to attend religious services and participate in religious rituals years down the line. Let's get into the data and stick around to the end to check out the interview I conducted with the lead scholar himself, Joe Henrich. Part 1. The data. Uganda, Sierra Leone, and Tajikistan have witnessed some of the most horrific episodes of violence of the late 20th century. Uganda suffered decades of violence starting in the late 1980s with the rise of the insurgent group called the Lord's Resistance Army, led by Joseph Kony. The LRA aimed to overthrow the Ugandan government. Towns were raided, children were abducted, and over 100,000 people were killed. As for Tajikistan and Sierra Leone, both countries witnessed horrifically violent wars throughout the 90s that killed tens of thousands of people. The scholars surveyed people in these countries who had been personally affected by these wars. We're not talking about people that might have heard gunshots going off in the night. We're talking about people who had household members killed and injured, who had children abducted and forced to fight in these wars, people who had suffered real, terrible trauma. And the scholars found that these experiences predicted an increased likelihood of religious group membership in all 3 countries. This was true across religious groups too. Uganda is primarily Christian, Tajikistan is primarily Muslim, and the sample group from Sierra Leone was about 1/3 Christian and 2/3 Muslim. But no matter your religion, if you had been personally affected by war, you were more likely to be attending your local church or mosque years later. There's a few theories explaining this data. Part 2. The war sociality hypothesis. Tons of studies have demonstrated that external threats cause communities to bond. In other words, external threats boost communal solidarity, cooperation, and sticking to social norms. For example, there's a band of brothers effect. Soldiers who fight together in battle forge tight, almost familial social bonds. One study on Libyan revolutionaries who fought against Gaddafi found that the fighters had tighter bonds with each other than with their own family members. Other studies have shown that competition between social groups increases cooperation within your own social group, kind of like an in-group versus out-group effect. Even natural disasters like earthquakes and hurricanes have this effect on society, increasing tightness and bonding within a community. It would make sense that religion is part of this phenomenon. Religion can be a social glue, but religion isn't specifically implicated in this research, just a general rise in social cohesion. Why are we seeing a specific increase in religion and not a rise in other types of social gatherings? In other words, what does religion offer to a war-torn community that might compel people to join after they're exposed to violence? Part 3. It's the rituals. I've always said that religion isn't just something that people believe, religion is something that people do. Religion is just as much a system of rituals as it is a system of belief. Religion is well suited to address the psychological trauma and uncertainty that war causes because of rituals. Basically, religion provides a whole toolkit of embodied practices to cope with these situations. The anthropologist Michael Jackson, no, not that Michael Jackson, the Harvard Divinity School professor Michael Jackson, calls this ritualization, the process of humans creating behaviors in a lifelong struggle to restore a sense of understanding and control in the face of perturbing and overwhelming everyday events. During the 2006 Israel-Hezbollah war, Jewish Israeli women who recited the Psalms on a daily basis experienced much lower rates of anxiety compared to women who didn't. In fact, the women who experienced experienced the most benefit from daily psalm recitation were the ones who were closest to the Lebanese border. The closer you were to rockets falling around you, the more the rituals helped to soothe your anxiety. And it's not just religious rituals. People who perform ritualized behavior before public speaking have lower rates of anxiety. The same goes for sports. The majority of professional baseball players, both in the US and Japan, exhibit ritualized behavior during baseball games, possibly to cope with the uncertainty and stress of the game. Rituals enable people to feel a sense of control over the instability and fractured nature of life, offering one explanation why attending religious rituals increases in war-torn countries. Part 4. The terror management theory. War exposes people to more than just stress and uncertainty. War forces people to confront death and their own mortality. And again, religion offers tools to cope with this according to the terror management theory of religion, also called TMT for short. TMT suggests that religion exists to soothe the fear of death and existential angst. It's the theory that argues that because humans are uniquely cursed with our awareness that we will die someday, we evolved religion to cope with this knowledge of our own mortality. This is a controversial theory, but some experiments have corroborated it. According to a study conducted by social psychologist Jonas, religious people are better able to manage the terror of death compared to non-religious people. Other studies have demonstrated that people who believe in an afterlife become more confident in its existence after being reminded of death. And remember, the people who were surveyed in Uganda, Tajikistan, and Sierra Leone were not just reminded of death, they personally experienced it with the loss of loved ones. So we might be seeing empirical evidence here for the terror management theory. So the study argues that war creates the social and psychological conditions that would compel people to seek out a religious community. First, because religion offers communal benefits, such as greater solidarity and cooperation, but also the psychological benefits of addressing trauma and uncertainty. Let's go back to Sam Harris's and Christopher Hitchens' comments at the start of this video. The idea that religion causes war. Many would agree with this. After all, religious sectarian violence is a ubiquitous feature in human history, and it's easy to conclude that religion is the catalyst of these conflicts. But the idea that war increases religiosity, and religiosity causes war are not necessarily mutually exclusive. In fact, Henrich and his team suggest that we might be seeing a feedback loop. But let's not be too quick to draw firm conclusions. Like any scholarly research, this study had some shortcomings, and the researchers were very transparent about this. They admit that they relied primarily on self-reports of religious membership and ritual attendance to measure religiosity. But of course, religiosity is so much more than this. For example, they mention that their study doesn't dig into the individual's religious beliefs about the supernatural, as in they don't demonstrate that war can cause an increase in beliefs in the afterlife or the agency of God, the very types of beliefs that scholars cite when trying to prove the terror management theory. The study also doesn't explore specific rituals, like war is increasing how often you pray, or how often you recite psalms, going back to that study on the Israel-Hezbollah war. So when we say that war might be increasing religiosity, we really should put an asterisk by that word religiosity, because we're talking about a very specific thing, attending religious rituals and participating in a religious community. But rather than debunking this study, I think these shortcomings simply demonstrate the need for more research in this field, especially since this research has major implications for diplomacy and peacemaking efforts. Now let's go even deeper. I sat down with Dr. Joe Henrich himself, one of the lead scholars on this study, and he talks more in depth about his findings. I've started a second channel where I'll be posting all of my future interviews, so head on over there, subscribe to the new channel, and as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Now, one thing that's interesting to think about is I think there's other evidence to suggest that religions make people more cooperative, make them bond better as a group, lead to greater solidarity. So one possibility is that there have been historical feedbacks where religion led to a group, say, spreading, widely diffusing, and then the experience of war made them more religious. And so you can imagine you get some kind of feedback loop.